Detroit, Michigan, January 1st, 1970. 8:20 a.m. The city that built America's cars wakes up to a new decade with the absolute confidence of an institution that has never seriously been challenged. General Motors controls 54% of the American automobile market. Ford and Chrysler divide most of the rest. The Big Three, as they have been called for decades, with the particular pride of an industry that considers its own dominance a law of nature rather than a circumstance of history, produce more automobiles than the rest of the world combined. Detroit is not worried about Japan. Japan makes small cars, cheap cars, cars that American consumers, who want space, power, chrome, and the particular sensation of commanding a vehicle the size of a small boat, have no interest in. Japanese cars are novelties, curiosities, the automotive equivalent of a joke. The joke Detroit is about to discover is on them, because 15 years from this morning, General Motors will have lost 20 points of market share. Chrysler will have gone bankrupt and been rescued by the federal government with a loan that humiliates everyone involved. Ford will have come within weeks of insolvency. And Toyota, the company that an American automotive executive once dismissed as a manufacturer of those funny little Japanese cars, will be on its way to becoming the largest automobile manufacturer on Earth. This is the story of how the most powerful industry in American history was destroyed. Not by accident, not by bad luck, not by forces beyond anyone's control, by a philosophy. Toyota Motor Corporation was founded in 1937 by Kiichiro Toyota, the son of a textile machinery manufacturer who had become convinced that the future of Japan's industrial development lay in automobiles rather than looms. The timing was catastrophic. Japan went to war. The factory was converted to military production. The war ended in atomic devastation and national humiliation. The occupation authorities briefly considered shutting Toyota down entirely. Kiichiro Toyota, surveying the ruins of his country and his company in 1945, made a decision that would define Japanese manufacturing for the next half-century. He decided that the only way to survive was to be better than everyone else, not cheaper, better. This distinction mattered enormously. The conventional wisdom of post-war Japanese manufacturing was that Japan's competitive advantage lay in low labor costs, that Japanese companies could produce acceptable products at lower prices than American or European competitors and win markets through price alone. Toyota rejected this. He had visited American factories before the war. He had seen the Ford River Rouge complex, the most advanced manufacturing facility in the world, and he had understood something that most Japanese industrialists had not, that the American system's strength was not just its scale, but its logic. The moving assembly line, the standardized parts, the precise sequencing of operations, these were ideas, and ideas could be studied and improved. He set his engineers to studying them. The man who turned the study into a revolution was Taiichi Ohno. Ohno was a Toyota engineer who had spent years thinking about why manufacturing produced so much waste. Wasted time, wasted materials, wasted motion, wasted human effort. He had observed that American factories, for all their scale and efficiency, were organized around assumptions that nobody had thought to question. American factories produced in large batches. They stamped out 10,000 door panels at once, stored them in warehouses, retrieved them when needed. They kept enormous inventories of parts at every stage of production because the cost of running out of parts, shutting down the line, was worse than the cost of storing too many. This logic seemed unassailable. It had been the foundation of mass production since Henry Ford. Ohno decided it was wrong. The inventory, he argued, was not a solution to the problem of production uncertainty. It was evidence of the problem. It was proof that the system didn't work reliably enough to produce what was needed when it was needed. The inventory was a buffer against failure, and buffers against failure allowed failure to continue rather than forcing it to be solved. he developed what became known as the Toyota Production System, later called lean manufacturing by the Western academics who studied it. Its principles were simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to implement. Produce only what is needed, when it is needed, in the amount needed. Stop the production line immediately when a defect is discovered, rather than allowing the defect to continue through the system. Give every worker the authority and the responsibility to identify problems and stop production to fix them. Continuously improve every process, every day, forever. The Japanese term for this last principle, kaizen, meaning continuous improvement, became one of the most important words in the history of manufacturing. It meant that Toyota never stopped getting better. Detroit, by contrast, had largely stopped trying. The American automobile industry of the 1950s and 1960s was not lazy. It was not stupid. It was not unaware of competition. It was successful. And success in large institutions is the most effective suppressant of the urgency that drives improvement. The Big Three had developed a model of automobile development that worked extremely well for the market conditions of post-war America. Annual model changes that created the appearance of progress while sharing most components between years, marketing that emphasized style over substance, dealer networks that created captive markets in communities with limited alternatives. The system produced enormous profits. The profits funded lobbying that protected the industry from regulation. The regulatory protection reduced the competitive pressure that might have forced improvement. The reduced competitive pressure allowed the profits to continue. It was, from the inside, a perpetual motion machine. From the outside, it was a system optimized for a market that was about to change in ways that none of its architects had planned for. The oil crisis of 1973 was the earthquake. In October 1973, the Arab members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, announced an oil embargo against the United States in response to American support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The price of oil quadrupled in months. Gasoline, which American consumers had treated as essentially unlimited and essentially free, became expensive and sometimes unavailable. Americans lined up at gas stations in lines that stretched for blocks. Some stations ran out entirely. The federal government implemented rationing, and American consumers, for the first time in a generation, began asking a question that Detroit had never needed to answer. How many miles does this car get per gallon? The answer, for the large, heavy, powerful American cars that Detroit had been building, was terrible. The answer, for the small, light, carefully engineered Japanese cars that Toyota and Honda and Datsun had been selling in increasing numbers since the late 1960s, was excellent. The Toyota Corolla got 30 miles per gallon. The Chevrolet Impala got 13. American consumers waiting in gas lines with their Impalas noticed this. Detroit's response to the oil crisis was the response of an industry that had never had to change quickly. They announced that they would build smaller, more fuel-efficient cars. They set timelines. They allocated budgets. They convened committees. They produced studies. What they could not do was actually build the cars. Because building fuel-efficient cars was not simply a matter of making cars smaller. It required a complete rethinking of how cars were engineered. Lighter materials, more efficient engines, better aerodynamics, tighter manufacturing tolerances that reduced waste and improved reliability. Detroit's factories were not built for this. Detroit's engineers had not been trained for this. Detroit's management systems were not designed for the kind of rapid, continuous improvement that building a fundamentally different kind of car required. Toyota's factories were built for exactly this, the Toyota Production System. With its emphasis on quality at the source, on continuous improvement, on eliminating waste at every stage of production, had been quietly making Toyota better every year for 2 decades. When the market suddenly demanded exactly what Toyota had been building, Toyota was ready. Detroit was not. The quality gap became visible in the late 1970s and was undeniable by the early 1980s. Consumer Reports, the American publication that tested products and reported results without accepting advertising from the manufacturers it evaluated, began publishing reliability statistics that were humiliating for American manufacturers. Toyota and Honda vehicles consistently rated at the top of reliability surveys. American vehicles consistently rated at the bottom. The gap was not marginal. It was the difference between vehicles that broke down occasionally and vehicles that broke down regularly. American consumers, who had grown up with the assumption that cars required constant maintenance and frequent repair, discovered through Japanese cars that this was not a law of nature but a consequence of manufacturing quality. And having discovered it, they were not interested in going back. The market share numbers told the story. In 1970, Japanese manufacturers held approximately 4% of the American automobile market. By 1980, they held 21%. By 1990, they held 30%. The American manufacturers had not lost these customers through bad luck or unfair competition. They had lost them because their products were demonstrably worse and their organizations were not capable of improving fast enough to close the gap. The human cost landed in Detroit. The automobile industry had been the foundation of the American working class for 60 years. The UAW, the United Auto Workers Union, had negotiated wages and benefits that allowed assembly line workers to own homes, send children to college, retire with pensions. The middle-class prosperity of post-war America was built in significant part on the wages that the Big Three paid. As market share declined, production declined. As production declined, workers were laid off. The communities that had grown up around the factories, the neighborhoods, the schools, the churches, the small businesses that served the workers, began to hollow out. Detroit, the city, began its long decline from one of America's most prosperous industrial cities to a symbol of deindustrialization and urban abandonment that would take decades to begin to reverse. The human beings who had built their lives around the assumption that the American automobile industry was permanent and dominant had not been wrong to make that assumption. They had simply been living in a moment that was about to end. The clearest demonstration of what had happened came in 1984, when General Motors and Toyota opened a joint venture factory in Fremont, California called NUMMI, New United Motor Manufacturing, Inc. The Fremont factory had previously been a GM plant. It had been closed in 1982 because it was the worst-performing factory in the GM system, the highest absenteeism rate, the lowest quality scores, the most contentious labor relations. The workforce had been known for sabotage, for drinking on the job, for a level of disengagement from the quality of what they produced that had made the factory's products embarrassing, even by the standards of an industry that had become accustomed to quality problems. Toyota agreed to manage the reopened factory using the Toyota production system. The workforce was largely the same workers who had been employed in the closed GM factory. Within 2 years, the NUMMI factory was producing vehicles that ranked among the highest quality cars made in North America. The same workers, different system, different results. This was the clearest possible demonstration of what Detroit had refused to understand for 15 years, that the problem was not the workers. The problem was the system, and the system could be changed. Detroit understood this too late to save itself from the consequences of having not understood it sooner. General Motors filed for bankruptcy on June 1, 2009. It was the fourth largest bankruptcy in American history. The federal government provided $49.5 billion in bailout funds. Thousands of dealerships were closed. Tens of thousands of workers lost jobs and pensions. The company that had once controlled half of the American automobile market had become an institution that could not survive without government rescue. Toyota, in 2008, became the largest automobile manufacturer in the world by production volume, the first time in the history of the industry that an American company had not held that position. The story of Toyota and Detroit is not ultimately a story about Japan versus America. It is not a story about culture or work ethic or national character. It is a story about ideas. Taiichi Ohno's ideas about manufacturing, that quality should be built into the process rather than inspected in afterward, that waste should be eliminated rather than accommodated, that every person in the organization should be empowered to improve the system, were not culturally specific. They were not Japanese. They were engineering principles that worked wherever they were applied. The NUMMI experiment proved this. American workers applying Toyota's system produced Toyota-quality cars. Detroit had the same workers. It had more resources, more history, more capital, more everything except the one thing that actually mattered, the willingness to change. Toyota had the willingness to change because it had always understood that survival required it. A company founded in the ruins of a defeated nation, with no natural resources, no protected market, no institutional advantages. A company that had to earn everything it had, understood in its bones that standing still was the same as dying. Detroit had forgotten this. The decades of dominance had felt like destiny rather than achievement. The profits had felt like natural law rather than the temporary result of particular circumstances. When the circumstances changed, Detroit discovered that destiny had limits. Toyota is still improving, every day,